Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Art Curators Conference. Good morning. My name is Juliette Source. I am the VP of Advocacy here at AMC's Board of Trustees, and I'm also the Executive Vice President of Resnickow & Associates. We are a communications firm that serves the arts and culture. I am so honored to be here with you today to introduce our first keynote speaker, Angie Brice Thomas, who is a thought leader in diversity strategy and recruitment. Angie is a little under the weather today, but so will not be able to be with us in person, but I'm so happy that she can join us remotely. This presentation will bring to the fore a discussion about how to center DEI into an organization and its culture, how to extend these values outward in developing a pipeline and removing bias from recruitment and hiring. Angie brings over 15 years of experience in diversity, equity, access, and inclusion work and executive coaching. She launched her career as an educator, earning her master's in sociology and education from Columbia University's Teachers College. And for more than a decade, she held leadership positions at Teach for America, where she helped to build a team that recruited the most diverse core of teachers in the organization's history. Since 2018, Angie has led her own practice, coaching organizations on how to grow talented and diverse teams, how to foster inclusive communities and company cultures. Angie was a key consultant to the Cross-Museum DEAI Task Force that was formed in the summer of 2020 by New York City Museum directors and leaders. And over the course of that year, she helped to develop a toolkit that serves as a model and a resource for best practices in DEAI recruitment and hiring. And with that, I hope you will join me in welcoming Angie to the virtual stage.
Hello, everyone. I think I'm live again, so I'm going to go ahead and get started again. Apologies for all the technical issues, but I'm just going to give us another take. Welcome again, everyone, and I'm excited to be a keynote this morning. To give you a sense for the work, this presentation this morning is going to cover about 2 years worth of work that I have the pleasure and privilege of doing in partnership with the New York City Cross-Museum DEAI Task Force, which was a response to the summer of 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. About 16 different museums and their leaders got together and asked themselves the question, what are we doing within our institutions and across our city to advance diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion? So I hope to talk through the lens of recruitment, hiring, and pipeline development, given that that is not only what I focused on over the past couple of years within New York City, but it also my life's work in my area of expertise, having spent a decade at Teach for America, but also as an educator. Next slide. So a little bit more about me. You heard from Juliette. I'm just going to go ahead and skip over because of time, but excited to be here again. Next slide. I was quickly saying our firm, Brice Consulting Group, is a boutique firm right here in New York City. And so at this point, we've had the privilege of working with nearly every single museum and museum mile, from large institutions like the Guggenheim and the Whitney, to medium institutions, to smaller institutions like the Morgan, a Jewish museum, and many other museums. So it's been quite a pleasure to do that. In addition, because we understand DEI work is not just unique to the museum sector, we actually are quite industry agnostic. And so you'll find us in Silicon Valley, you'll find us in the entertainment space, you'll find us in education, you'll find us in academia. And so as a result of working with different companies across different industries and different institutions, it has given us a global perspective of how to approach diversity, equity, and inclusion in a very nimble sense. Next slide. Okay, so this is the agenda for today. I want to give you a sense for the work that the Cross-Museum DEAI Task Force did. I want to walk you through the planning and the process, and then the outcomes and takeaways, and I hope to leave at least 10 minutes for a question. Having delivered a similar presentation in other spaces, people really, really appreciate the Q&A question, because what I end up finding is that people actually take the learnings from here and go and replicate it in their city. So, you know, I have heard similar things being done in Chicago and being tested and piloted in other cities. And so excited for individuals who are joining from different cities and perhaps different countries across the globe who might be interested in leveraging some of the learnings here for their own context. Next slide. Before going any further, I would love to start with this quote that my dear friend, ID Ariude, who is the CFO and co-COO of the Whitney Museum, actually pulled when we first presented on this together a year ago. And this quote is by Darren Walker, who's the president of the Ford Foundation. He says, philanthropy can no longer grapple simply with what is happening in the world, but also how and why. And the reason why this is important is because at the end of the day, as cultural institutions, we are the culture bearers. We are the history tellers, right? We tell history. We control how history is told and retold to future generations. And so we have a responsibility to not only deliver what, but also the how and the why. And future generations who come behind us will ask us, what did we do? What was the mark that we left, and our further contribution to diversifying and making the world a much more equitable place? So we felt that this quote from Darren Walker was quite apropos. Okay, all right, let's keep going. Next slide, please. All right, so a little bit more about the Cross-Museum DEAI Task Force. And so the goals that the DEAI Task Force had brought me along to do were threefold. One was to create a set of common standards and practices of excellence for recruiting and hiring diversity museum staff. As you heard from my introduction from Juliet, I spent the first decade of my career at Teach for America, and I led the recruitment team there as a senior leader on that team, led the charge to that contributed to Teach for America becoming the largest and most diverse provider of first-year teachers to under-resourced schools and communities across our country. And I did that work alongside an incredible and amazing group of teammates and staff members. And so it was really interesting to be approached by different folks being like, oh my gosh, well, how did you make that happen? What is the secret sauce? And quite honestly, I was there for 10 years. So it actually took a very long time. And so all that is to say the work of diversifying staff and living into DEAI is not a work that is done overnight. It does take time. And so I hope to give you a bit of nugget around that. Number two, the process. The process involved a number of surveys, focus group, one-on-one conversations. By the end of the work, the project, we had surveyed over 16 museums. We had done about 3 to 4 focus group with museum leaders, particularly HR leaders, and I had engaged in over 20 one-on-one conversation with senior to middle leader to entry-level leaders and staff members across a variety of museums to deeply understand the context. And then the outcome ultimately were 3 products, a landscape analysis, a best practices guide, and a benchmarking recommendation diversity tool. Toward the end of this presentation, there'll be a QR code that will give you access to our DEI library. If I were in person, I would bring your books that we have published, but I'll be happy to get those to Judith, who can get those to you. But essentially, we hope to walk you through that. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so this is the task force, the team that made up the museum. I would be remiss to not acknowledge all the amazing humans who went into this project. And so you can see we had representatives from small museums like the Museum of Art and Design to larger museums like the Guggenheim and the Whitney to everything else in between. And so each of these leaders actually met every single Friday for an entire year and a half, starting in the summer of 2020. They started the work in 2020. They brought me along in January of 2021, but we actually continued to work together. And at different parts in this project, myself and different members of this team actually presented at different conferences on the work that we've done. So I am deeply embedded to all of the individual humans who made this great work happen together. Moving along, please. Okay, so this is a bit about the process, the arc of the work. So like I mentioned, the group was established in the fall of 2020. And then by the winter of 2020, they actually administered a survey to 16 different museums. And there were like a lot of questions. And the questions were geared at museum HR leaders, but ultimately the HR leader needed to go to the director or other leaders in the institution to get the information they could. And so that was a baseline preliminary survey conducted. In the spring in 2021, that's when I was engaged specifically. And when I came in the spring, I took a deep dive into the survey results. As a data nerd that I am, I dug into the results to understand what was happening, what were some of the trends that we were seeing, were the responses and trends and patterns varying based on if it was a small museum, a medium-sized museum, if it was a diverse museum, a non-diverse museum, just to deeply understand that. By the summer of 2021, that's when I did a number of focus groups and one-on-one interviews. In fall of 2021, we received input from critical readers. We deeply believe that it's important to have your work poked at by other folks who are in the work. And so we invited critical readers, and we'll show you who they are in a minute, from different industries who are both in the museum space and outside of that, who actually are experts in DEI, to poke at our work and say, hey, here's what we're putting together. What is that? How does that sound to you? How does that read to you? What feedback do you have? What resonates? What doesn't? And we also did a presentation to the task force itself and AAMD. And then in spring of 2021, we presented at AAM conference. And so obviously now we're presenting here, but this gives you a sense for the arc of the work and how long it took. Next slide. I mentioned critical readers. So here are the 8 different folks that were so kind to give us their time and their talents to review our documents. Huge shout out to our own Judith here, who actually was one of our critical readers. But you can see we had folks from the Brooklyn Museum, folks from Columbia University. We had folks from the Museum of Metropolitan Museum of Art, and just lots of different places to give us input. Last but not least, Tom Finkelpearl, who's a former commissioner for the New York City Department of Cultural Arts and also the former director of Queens Museum, not only was a critical reader, but he actually wrote the foreword to the materials in the book that we put together. And so given that Tom had done a lot of this work when he was at Queens Museum, in many ways, we were able to test ideas with him and just get a lot of really good input from him. Next slide. All right, this, I want to frame this a little bit more. We talk about what of the work at the start of this presentation, and now we'll be addressing the why, which we alluded to in the Darren Walker quote. A few years ago, Harvard Business Review published this article. It is titled, "If there's only one woman in your candidate pool, there is statistically no chance that she'll be hired." Period, end of sentence. It didn't say there'll be a slight chance. It didn't say there's a 50% chance. It says there's statistically no chance. And that was a truly pivotal article that I brought to the DEI Museum Task Force, and in many ways turned the corner for us. I talk about my work at Teach for America and the work that I did before that. But at the end of the day, when Harvard did this study many, many years ago, and I think in many ways it was pivotal to the work that I did at Teach for America, they realized that at the end of the day, if you actually are not focused on the front end of your recruitment funnel and ensuring that is diverse, it doesn't matter how well-intentioned you are, the end outcome that you're seeking for is unlikely to be true. It means that if you have 100 candidates and only one is a woman, even if she's the most qualified woman, she's won all the accolades in the world, she has all the Pulitzer Prizes, I mean, she could have won everything. She is the best of the best. If she's the only person like herself in that pool, she's unlikely to get that job because statistically it's just not possible. And so that study was a groundbreaking study to show us at the end of the day, if you look at the first row, if you have, actually look at the bottom row, if you have one woman and 3 men in a pool, has 0 chance of getting that job, even if she's the most qualified. And I say, like, she has all the accolades and is truly the leading candidate by a long shot. If the pool is 50-50, there are 2 women, 2 men, she has a 50% shot of getting the role. And if it's 3 women, 1 man, she has a 67% shot. And the reason that was important is because we found that at the end of the day, there are so many unconscious biases that creep up. And at the end of the day, the process matters and quantity matters. And so in many ways, that study validated the reason why at the end of the day, when we say that we want to diversify our spaces, if we are not doing the work to diversify the applicant pool, it doesn't matter what our intentions are. It doesn't matter how welcoming the committee is. It doesn't matter how diverse and inclusive the selection committee is. It doesn't matter how great the offer letter is and the salary quote. None of those things matter because they're actually toward the middle and the end of the process. If your pool is actually not strategically diverse from the very beginning, you're not going to get the results that you want. So I wanted to name that because I think it's a fascinating study that I would encourage you all to read through. But I think in many ways, it actually really set the stage for us to do the work and accelerate the thing that we're doing. If my colleague who is on the was on the task force, who's an attorney, was here, she would say, wait, are you saying, am I focused on quotas? The answer is no, it's not about quotas. It's more around like how we focus about the diversity of the pool, right? If you're looking to hire engineers and you're looking for engineering skills, my sense is you probably want to have engineers in your pool of candidates, right? Don't be surprised if you're hiring for engineers, but then you end up with their engineers as finalists because there are no engineers in your pool to begin with. So I just want to name that. All right, moving on to the next slide. I want to quickly walk through the 3 things that we produced. So the summary landscape analysis, I'll give you a 2 seconds overview, and then we'll go into deep dive. This was basically a comprehensive memo of the state of the museum sector as of the summer of 2021. And it's basically after looking under the hood of all the museums who decided to participate, that actually celebrated and highlighted the wins and the glows, the things that are going well, but also named the grows and the things that we needed to get better at. And then the recruitment and hiring best practices guide. This is basically a compilation of my 10+ years of expertise and work across lots of different places of how do you build an incredibly strong and diverse pool? How to actually create a process and an interview guide that is robust? How do you actually leverage a curated set of questions that are actually tested by data and research that are actually going to work? How do you mitigate bias? How do you actually communicate an offer? How do you think about the way in which you develop a candidate exercise and how much time should you give in a candidate exercise? And last but not least is a diversity evaluation tool. And basically this is where we suggest a set of recommendations for if a organization wants to start diversifying and you're starting at point A, who should be your North Star and how do you go about that? Next slide. Since I'm not in person, I won't be able to do this, but essentially I will give you access to this in a minute. But essentially we've ended up building a museum library on our website where you can access these tools. And it actually allows for a great collaboration between museum leaders who are actually able to have conversation, go in and see which tool is most popular, is most looked at, is most engaged with by different museum leaders. On the next slide, I think I'm going to see if this works, but Judith and Lucy, you may have to text me to confirm this is working. If you're in the audience, hold up your phone and try to see if you can scan the QR code and register quickly and see if you can download any materials. If you can't, that's fine. But if anybody can give me like a thumbs up in the chat, or Lucy or Judith can text me, that would be helpful. If not, we can just keep going. You'll certainly get access to these soon. And again, if it doesn't work, no worries, you'll get access to these soon. Okay, seems to be working. You may be asked to create a login. I'll give maybe 1 more minute. Okay, cool. Sounds like it's working. I'm going to keep going. No worries if you're not able to get into it. But moving on to the next slide, summary landscape analysis. All right, this is where I'm going to summarize some of the key learnings from our work. And as you're hearing these learnings, I would love for you to just like hold your own experience at your own museum or your institution as like a backdrop, just to see to the extent to which that might resonate, so that when we get to the Q&A section, I'd love to hear some reactions you have. So after the deep analysis of the survey results, the one-on-one conversation, the focus groups, I created a headline story. And I, as a sociologist by training, I approach my work by saying, if I had to just put this as a one-liner in the New York Times, what would be that headline story, right? And the headline story that became apparent to me was a story of unfulfilled aspirations. And I said this with all the respect and humility in the world for the incredible work that all the museums that we have partnered with have done. But what's fascinating is that everybody agreed with that story. So what do I mean by that? Let's start with the wins. So what was incredibly apparent, and that was like a very clear trend and pattern, a big win, a big learning is that there was just a collective philosophical commitment to diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. Yes, it was the summer of 2020 when many museums and many institutions across different industries were leaning into DEI a bit more. But to be honest with you, there are actually a few museums that actually had begun that work well before the summer of 2020 and well before the murder of George Floyd. And I'd be remiss to not name that and give them their due. But by and large, I felt there was a genuine commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility as a philosophy and as a commitment. So I think, from institution to institution, by and large, people were deeply committed to it. That's one. Number two, by that point, the vast majority of museums had actually engaged their staff in DEI trainings and dialogues. At that point, the vast majority of staff across the institution had been trained, senior leaderships had been trained, some had moved to their board being trained in DEI. And so we saw a large number of institutions actually leading through trainings with their staff among DEI. And third was a trend that we actually had started to also notice. We started terminating unpaid internships because we recognize unpaid internship actually favors a certain profile of student from a certain demographic, right? Especially if you're taking an unpaid internship in New York City, it's a little difficult to afford rent in the city in the summer if you don't have a job, right? Unless you have some sort of resource coming from another place. And so it favored students who are mostly higher income, who also tended to be white. And so by and large, students who could have been interns of color or from humble backgrounds and humble household were unlikely to land these internships because you just cannot do that in a city like New York. What I do want to name on number three is that I had been working with the Guggenheim Museum as their chief diversity consultant for 3 years prior to that. And I will say that Guggenheim was one of the early trailblazers that decided to end unpaid internships. Though when the idea was first proposed by me, it felt very uncomfortable of a thought to even entertain, just because no one had never done that before. And so when I said, listen, here are the risks, but here are the reward, and here are how the wins are going to outweigh the potential challenges, we were able to not only triple the application numbers. The year that we decided to end unpaid internship, they received 1,800 applications. And within that same year, 56% of applicants identified as people of color, and 48% of them identified as first-generation college students. Whereas in the previous class, not a single intern was a person of color. And I think only one may have been from a humble background. So all that is to say, with support from our firm, with like recruitment strategy, marketing, and partnering with different cities and colleges across the colleges and universities across the city, but across the country, where you can actually have access to diverse talent who would love to work, they just can't work for free. Neither should anyone work for free. We're able to do that. So I think in many ways, the Guggenheim served as a roadmap for many other institutions. So all that is to say, a big one is that many museums had done away with unpaid internship and actually had found tremendous support from their boards and donors and patrons to actually offer paid internships. So that was a big one. Moving on to the next slide. Oh, that's the wins I just spoke about. I'll pause here to let you actually absorb the wins that I just spoke about. A deep philosophical commitment to DEI, engaging their staff in trainings, and then stopping unpaid internships. Next slide. All right, so I talked about a story of unfulfilled aspirations. So the aspirations are the wins, and then let's talk about the gaps. There are some growth areas that we discovered. So number one, there seemed to be a level of uneasiness and discomfort with the idea of collecting data around diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. And to be very transparent, of all the industries that our firm have partnered with, I would say the museum industry is one that is the least, I think, that has the most amount of work to do in actually collecting that information. All that is to say, most other industries, it is actually very much second nature to collect information about someone's demographic background. When you're applying for a job or an internship, it is very common that you ask somebody to list their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, if they would like, their socioeconomic status, or do they identify as coming from a humble background or not. It is actually very much practice in every other industry. And yet in the museum space, it is a space that I saw at least practice. And so therefore, it made sense that people felt very uneasy about, what do you mean? I'm gonna put that in an application? That's just not something that we do. Well, unless you start doing it, it's not going to become normal. And I think what we've learned for the museum that actually have started to do this, and you know who you are if you're in the room, we've learned that applicants actually don't even bat an eyelash. They expect to be asked that question because everywhere else they're applying for jobs, they're being asked that question. So it actually has not been an issue at all. But that is one of the gaps. The idea of normalizing the collection of demographic data from applicants is something that museums are working on. Number two, we discovered there's a need to unlock structural supports and standardizing best practices for pipeline development, recruitment, and hiring. So for example, it takes capacity, it takes people, and it takes money to do something like this, right? And so I recognize every museum has a different set of resources. If you're super large and you have a HR team of 50 people with lots of folks working on things versus your team of 1 or a team of 2, it's going to look very different for you, right? And so recognizing the structural limitations within the capacity constraint and the bandwidth constraint within an institution, and supporting institution to get additional capacity, expanding the team or outsourcing the work or bringing in additional consultancy support to get it done is important. Number 3, I sense there is a huge tension between everyone saying, yes, this sounds awesome. I want to do all these great things and have a robust process and have all these things done ahead of time. But Angie, I need to hire yesterday, right? And so I think that is true in many, many roles. But I want to name that tension is real. And it came to the forefront in those conversations in particular. And last but not least, there continues to be a need and a desire to foster a culture of belonging for staff, for all staff, regardless of their background. I think one of the things that I heard from folks who are cautiously optimistic, they said, I'm really excited about this. And at the end of the day, it's not going to be enough that we bring in diverse staff. We actually have to create a culture where they feel like they're going to belong, they're going to thrive. And so I think I appreciate the active acknowledgement of the need to foster a culture of belonging so that people don't just come and it's not a pit stop on their way to something, but actually it is a long-term experience and journey that they have within our institutions. Okay. The Recruitment Best Practices Guide, that's the next tool. Next slide, please. So there are 3 strands that we developed, one on pipeline development. And if you were able to make it into the DEAI Museum Library, you got to see that. But basically, it details what do you need to do to build a diverse pool. It is a set of heavily curated lists of different places that you can go, places that you can go to actually build a diverse pool. We identify select set of engines where you can actually go to actually find diverse talent, some of which actually were not familiar with the museum space or were not being used, but are now being used more and more. For example, a few museums have actually recently found some great talent through higher ed jobs, which actually is not where we go. We typically go to NYFA, right? And Indeed, but simply hired.ed.com, and more recently, even LinkedIn. There are more places that you can find great talent. And so that's one of the places to also find diverse talent. We supported museums in actually identifying their organizations whose jobs are to actually build diverse pools of talent. So I think of Management Leaders of Tomorrow, MLT. I think of SEO, Sponsors of Educational Opportunity. I think of Raven. These are organizations whose job is to find and groom incredibly diverse talent to take on great jobs, right? And so our museums should be taking advantage of these great pools of talent, not just the finance industry and the banking industry and all the other private spaces, right? And so I want to ensure that our museums are set up to build relationships with these entities whose jobs are to build diverse talent for institutions. The second thing was recruitment processes. So this is where we created a set of resources for folks. You won't be able to see this here in the presentation since I'm not in person to walk through it myself, but there's a draft recruitment action plan where on the recruitment action plan, there's a tab, and on the tab, it has a set of 76 heavily curated, deeply researched, vetted questions that you can ask and you should ask in an interview process, and it matches against a skill. Let's say that you're assessing cultural competence. You can go through that and search through any of the 7 or 8 cultural competence questions. Let's say that you're assessing for collaboration or analytical skills or emotional intelligence, whatever you're assessing for, the skill or the mindset, there are questions that you actually can ask. And what I did is just look through 10 years worth of research and data and learnings and pulled out some of our best learnings from questions. And these are not not just random questions. These are questions that we actually tested in interviews and actually have seen how candidates responded. Did candidates of color respond differently than white candidates? Why is that? Is there something wrong with the question and how it's being asked? And so these are questions that actually have worked. And so I would strongly encourage you when you get a chance to check out these tools, because we put a lot of work into them. We found that they actually work, and the institutions that have used them actually found them really helpful. Last but not least is the hiring practices. And so we created interview arcs for folks. So let's say that you decide you want to have 3 sets of interviews, right? Who should be on your first interview? Who should be on the second interview? What should that look like? Anything from what is, an equitable rejection letter? What should that look like and sound like? There are templates for those. What is a great offer, note looks like? We give guidance on the candidate exercise. So for example, the research shows that it is best to ensure that there's a weekend involved when you give a candidate exercise to be completed, so that the candidate has time. You don't know if the person is a parent or a significant other or a partner or has other things in their lives. When you give a candidate a weekend to do their exercise, the result of that exercise is actually better and stronger. That's what the data shows. We've tested it across. You're like, well, I give the exercise on a Monday and the candidate exercise is due on a Friday. The person who has a weekend to do the candidate exercise actually produces better work than the person who was given just a weekday. So we strongly encourage that you always make it a best practice. And many of the companies I work with now, they always give a weekend, right? And so these are some of the things that we are teaching and have taught and have seen museum use and actually found really, really helpful. All right, next slide. The diversity evaluation tool. So this is the last tool before I pause for Q&A. Essentially, this tool just allows you to get a sense for where are you and your current diversity journey and where do you want to be. And so there are a couple of benchmarks that we propose. And so when you open the tool on the library, you'll be able to see a couple of things. It would allow you to put in your demographic information. So what percentage of your staff identifies white, Black, Latinx, blah, blah, blah. And then it tells you to select what your aspiration is. Now you want to be very thoughtful about that. Is your aspiration what the AMC Mellon Foundation report said we should be at a few years ago? Is your aspiration where your city is census data wise? Is your aspiration something else? And so it allows you to put where you are and put where you want to be, and then gives you ideas for what you want to do to get there. It also gives you a tool to actually figure out if you want to hire for 4 roles, and let's say that you want to ensure that 50% of the roles, 50% of the candidates are candidates of color, it actually gives you a numerical formula for how to backwards map to ensure if you want to hire for 4 roles, you need X number of applications, and of these number of application, X number need to identify as blah, blah, blah. Again, this is not telling you need to hire a person of color. It is telling you need to begin with XYZ pool and let the process play itself out. When you have a fair process that begins with a diverse pool, the outcome will play itself out. And it's less about like, is the person of color hired, or is the white person hired at the end, or is the person from a low-income background, a person from privileged background hired at the end? That's not what the process is about. It's about, did I do the work on the front end of setting up an equitable process on the very front end? And so it actually gives you ideas for, if you, based on historically how many applicants you need for this job, do you need to have a pool of 75 people or 15 people? It actually gives you that level of granular detail and supports you with it. So all of these things you can find on our website when you have access to it. All right, with that, on to the next slide. I'm going to pause for Q&A and would love to take questions and reactions people have. I'm not sure how that works. So Lucy, Judith, and others, please feel free to manage up to me on how this process works at this point.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really informative. How do you suggest us going back to our institutions and getting team buy-in from our colleagues who may not see DEIA work as imperative? How do you suggest we navigate some of that friction that may arise by doing this work?
Thank you. And what is your name? Can I ask?
Oh, my name is Charlie Farrell. I'm with the St. Louis Art Museum.
Thank you, Charlie. That's a great question. I mean, the first question I would ask is like, I would want to understand like, why does that friction exist? I would imagine it's one of a few things. One, people actually do care, but the operationalization of it seems like a daunting task. Number two, people actually do care, but the resources constraint seems very large. And so I think I'd want to get clear on the why. My guess is you probably have a sense for the why. Number two, you are welcome to, send this presentation over to them if you'd like. I think what is most helpful is just being able to see that, like, here's how New York City did it, and here's how I did it together, and picking your starting point. You may not be ready for a diversity evaluation tool, right? But you might be ready to actually use better questions in your interview process. You may not be ready to completely revamp your interview guide, but you might be ready to add the blurb that actually I've suggested to museums to add in their job descriptions that actually has been really helpful. So I'm actually going to try to find it. But there's a blurb that museums have started to add in their job description that actually makes a difference, because what we see is that oftentimes for women and people of color, unless they meet 100% of the qualification of the job, they actually do not apply for that job. And so what we found is that there's actually as a blurb when you include JD, it makes a huge difference. So for museums that actually could not do much, this is where they started, and it reads something like this. Literally, this is what you add in a JD, and it makes a huge difference in terms of your ability to spike up the diversity of your applicant pool. Research shows that women and individuals from underrepresented backgrounds often apply to jobs only if they meet 100% of the qualifications. We recognize that it is highly unlikely that an applicant meets 100% of the qualifications for a given role. Therefore, if much of this job description describes you, then you're highly encouraged to apply for this role. That little blurb alone makes a huge difference and actually allowed for a lot of museums to really increase the diversity of their pool. So I think, Charlie, to answer your question, I would pick a starting point that makes sense for you. And perhaps that is what the only starting point is. Doing that first and just the JDs for openings that you have. And that is where you begin. And then further down the road, you can add more to your processes. But I would just pick the starting point that makes sense for you, knowing that you may not be ready or able to do much bigger things until a later point. I hope this helps.
Thanks. I just had a question. I'm Sandra Eden from DiverseWorks in Houston. And one of the things that we've put in our job listings is always listing pay, that salaries have to be included. And I don't know, I'm sure you recommend that also. And then the second thing is we used to just put, whether we wanted a BFA or MA or PhD, but now we actually say that or work or life experience. To open up the candidates that we get for jobs that we're posting, which has been helpful. Anyway, connected to that, I also want to say, you talked about unconscious bias, and I wonder if you could, in getting your candidate pool and selecting them, but I thought if you could talk a little bit about what you found in the actual interviews where unconscious bias, even though you have your candidates that you think reflect diversity, that they're in the interview, that there's some expectations that certain candidates in some people's mind might not be met, and that's just a bias that's ingrained. If you did.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So we talk about this in the resource recruitment and hiring guide as well. So I'll talk about two concepts, very important. If you remember nothing else, for everybody in the room, remember these two: the halo effect and the horn effect. What is the halo effect? Halo, H-A-L-O. The halo effect creeps up in an interview where you have an incredible candidate and they're answering lots of great questions, and they say one amazing thing about that one time they really crushed it. They went above and beyond. They just crushed it. They exceeded their goals. They were truly killing it, which is awesome and great. And you're just stuck on that one time and that one thing, even though the rest of the interview is actually quite mediocre or actually not as great, and there are concerning things that they say. We literally put a halo over that person's head. And I've been guilty of that myself. We all probably are, right? You put a halo over that person's head and nothing else they say matters. And throughout the entire debrief of the interview, we are stuck on that one thing that they did that one time. And that is the thing you're leading on and leading with and deciding upon their hire. The opposite is also true. The horn effect, H-O-R-N, right? The candidate probably was more honest than they should have been. They talked about this one time where they really, they messed up or they dropped the ball. And it actually was not detrimental. It's just probably not the best interview answer, but they're actually quite honest, which actually I appreciate about candidates. And you were, even if that thing was not detrimental and the rest of the interview was actually stellar and spectacular, you are stuck on that one time they did that one thing that they said that just did not go so well. And that candidate forever has a horn around their head. And you just cannot get past that. And I cannot get past that. And even in the debrief, I'm like, but that XYZ happened. And so I named this because the halo and the horn effect are real. And I think we have to be aware of when those are playing out in interviews. And so that is one of the things that we teach in our materials, be aware of, right? When is a halo effect creeping up for you? When is a horn effect creeping up for you? But also be aware of your own biases as an interviewer. I know I have a bias toward data. I know that. I know that about myself. And so whenever I'm in interview settings, my interview colleagues know that about me. So they know to check me on that bias. And so going into an interview setting, I think it's important to understand what are the biases that the other colleagues on the interview board or committee have, so you're aware of different biases and blind spots, but also being most aware of when the halo and the horn effect creep up, because I think those are some of the most detrimental times that we see great candidates get passed up, or candidates that should be on extend an offer or not, and vice versa. So I hope this is helpful.
Hi, a virtual question came in. It says, do you have any data on the Canadian job sector in terms of the frequency of requesting demographic data for job candidates in the museum sector versus the wider sector? Wondering if it's the same or different from your US data.
That's a great question. I actually don't have data on the Canadian sector at all. I do have a few colleagues out in a couple of spaces in Montreal, so I think I could get some information from them, but at this very moment I don't. But if other people in the audience do, would love to chime in, would love to hear that. But at this moment I don't, unfortunately.
I don't have an answer to that particular question, but was hoping you might be able to share some insights on the work being done to bridge one of the gaps that you mentioned in fostering a culture of belonging in these institutions.
Can you repeat the question? I didn't catch the tail end of it.
Sure, sorry. Your point about fostering a culture of belonging being a gap, I wondered if you might be able to speak more to the work being done in that area. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I think what we found is that fostering a culture of belonging begins well before the person starts their employment at the museum. And in fact, one of the best practices that we've seen work is actually beginning that in the interview process and the actually recruitment process. Again, this is going to require some lift, so it all depends on how much capacity and resources you have. But essentially what we see is that, let's say that that you're applying for, you're hiring for 50 roles, right? And out of the 50, let's say you have 50 candidates as well. And looking at the pool, there are 10 candidates that actually are standout because they meet all the different things. It's actually okay to have, get to know you chats with folks early on. And we've actually found for candidates of color who are actually very strong candidates, it actually does help to have just like one-on-one 30-minute introductory chats with them. Because it helps you on the back end and retention. If a person's a strong candidate, and if they're also a candidate of color, they're probably being pursued by multiple people. You're not the only person looking at them. You're not the only place they're applying for, likely, right? And so if you want them, it's probably true that somebody else wants them too. And so what we found is that companies that have the greatest success there actually set up introductory conversations. So let's say that I'm applying for a job, and you see that I'm a strong candidate, you actually take the time early on in the process, whether it's an HR director or somebody in the institution, to say, hi, my name is so-and-so, I am with blah, blah, blah institution. I noticed that you recently applied for blah, blah, blah role here. We're super excited to get to know you better, blah, 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 blah. Just a get to know you conversation. That signals to the candidate that they're actually important to you, that you're looking at them. Because in the absence of that, what you do is just like, you overwhelm the candidate on the back end once you've given them the offer with like all the calls and all the messages, and that just can be very off-putting sometimes. But if you took the time to cultivate them early on, by the time that they get an offer from you, it's probably a no-brainer they're going to come to you, or they're going to go to the person who's been cultivating them the longest. And so I think that's one of the things. The other thing that we see is we actually ask candidates during the interview process, what does an inclusive environment look like for you? That is legit a question that I always ask interviewees. You see the interview process, you should see it not as a way for you to get information about the candidate, but you also need to know, how do you create a welcoming environment? When I'm interviewing candidates, I'm not just trying to understand, are you good for this role? I'm also trying to understand that what is going to take me to actually get you to say yes to the job and retain you long term. So I'm actually getting to know your personality and your style. So I will ask, like, what does a strong, equitable culture look like for you? And if it's actually having a coffee machine that works and is reliable, I'm making a note of that. This is very, small, but if it's something like ensuring that, I get a tour of the museum by the director, or it's ensuring that there's a space that office staff and support staff actually engage regularly. So I think, asking questions during the interview process that helps you understand what is the thing that's going to help the person feel like they're at home and stay, and then implementing those things. The last thing I will say, the first 90 days are really, really important. We have found that the first 90 days is indicative of how well the person is going to do and how happy they're going to be. So being very mindful of that experience and what needs to shift and change. I think we might be at time, but I hope this was helpful to answer your question.
We have time? I can. Hello. Hi, Angie. This is Mary Ann LaMonica, and thank you for your presentation. Since you work across industries, I wondered if you've been thinking with your team about how the affirmative action changes that may come will affect the work we're doing and you're doing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. What a great question. So for some of you who might not know, in June, so next month, the Supreme Court is going to come down with a decision on affirmative action. We are anticipating that it is likely to be a reversal of affirmative action as we know it, which is going to have some consequences. We don't yet know what those consequences are, but I would love to stay in touch with you because I think there are leaders across different institutions who are thinking through that. And so I would love to circle back, and maybe I circle back to Judith and others. I don't want to speak before my turn, but I think what I can say is that there are leaders across different institutions, from higher ed institutions, president, provost, chancellors, who are actually thinking through that, and leaders of organizations whose jobs are to find diverse talent who are thinking through these implications. But I think more to come in that decision in June. And I think it's likely to have some ripple effects, though it's less clear on the museum space specifically. But I think in higher ed, potentially it'll have some impact depending on the institution and how things are currently done, but I think more to come in that, and I'd love to circle back with you, as I'm actually actively in those conversations myself behind closed doors, and so would love to circle back. But I think that is certainly something that you all should be watching in June. Between June 1 and June 30th, a decision is likely to come down.
Hi, my name is Louise Cutler, and my question is how do you handle, because I know you talk about in your talk was about, hiring women and how, if it's uneven, but how do you handle that diversity part where it's like organizations are looking to hire minorities and the underserved, but being able to get a 2-for-1 where it's like, oh, okay, I can hire a Black woman, and then I've hired a woman and I've hired a Black woman, or I can hire a Hispanic and I've hired a woman, a female Hispanic. And so where it begins, where it's like, well, instead of hiring a qualified male, Black male, I can get a 2-for-1 by hiring a qualified Black woman. And so not only have I hired a Black person, I've also hired a female that fill that. So how do you deal with organizations where they are equally hiring not just women, but also minority males as well?
So is the question, what's the advice? Is 2-for-1?
Right. Yeah. How do you guys handle that? I mean, because it happens, because you have organizations where it's like, okay, I want to be inclusive and I want to diversify, but how do I do it? And I can say, hey, well, this male is really qualified, but this female is qualified, and I get to hire a woman too. So how do you handle that within your organization with companies and say, well, hey, this is something that you need to look at as well, as opposed to just getting a twofer?
Yeah. I think this is where you want to be very clear on your North Star. I think one of the things we talk about in the guide is, so before you even create a job description, you need to create a profile of your candidates. And I wish I could find a Post-it that is not written on my desk. Let me actually find one. So this is what I train people to do. The things you're looking for in a job, on a candidate, should fit on a Post-it card. And it should be no more than 3 to 5 sentences or bullet points. If you cannot communicate in 3 to 5 sentences or bullet points that you're looking for, you don't know what you're looking for. And so I would begin there. And that's how I begin all of my workshops. Before you write a job description that's like 5 pages long that nobody's going to read, take a Post-it and jot down the 3 to 5 things that are most critical. What is the thing that this person must crush in this role they have to get right? Because I think when you focus on the skill, then you're going to find the right candidate. So you notice you probably will not write 2 for 1 here, right? Ideally male and Black, or female and Latinx and blah, blah, blah. You'll focus on like, needs to be a strong communicator, needs to have strong data analysis chops, blah, 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 blah. And so I think this is where I would encourage people, focus on the Post-it. And I would actually do it yourself too. I mean, I do that myself when I'm looking for a role. Like, if I cannot, in 3 to 5 bullets or sentences, communicate what I'm looking for, then I don't know what I'm looking for. And so I would start there, because that's going to be your North Star, and everything else becomes clear. I think the 2 for 1, 3 for 1, 5 for 1, that just becomes like very sticky. And now you're not focused on the process. You're just trying to like get 2 for 1 at McDonald's. I mean, don't get me wrong. If you love McDonald's, that's great, but that's just not what you're about. So I would just focus on like your North Star and what is true. And I would focus on the Post-it, if that's helpful.
Hi, I'm Claudia Einecke. I have a question about the statistics you used at the very beginning about the likelihood or lack of a likelihood that a woman gets hired if there are, if she's 1 out of 4. When you compiled that statistics, did you pay attention to who actually is on the side of the people who are hiring? In other words, I could imagine, rightly or wrongly, that your statistics is absolutely spot on. If it's men doing, making the final decision. Is it different, however? Have you searched that at all? Do you think it's different if, let's say, the people hiring are all women? Is it still that they're not going to pick the woman? Or not, because I mean, I think in this room we have mostly women who are maybe or maybe in the future, at least in middle management positions, where they actually are the ones who are making the decisions. And I wonder if at that point it holds true what you found. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. So to be clear, the research was not done by me. It was done by the Harvard Business Review, and it was specifically done vis-a-vis higher education position roles. And so I just want to name, Brice Consulting didn't conduct the research, but we relied on it quite heavily, and it continued to hold true. In terms of who was on the other side, that's a good question. I'm not entirely sure, but I am happy to get you the link to the articles. I think it's in there, and but I would take a look at that. That would be really helpful. It's actually really helpful to take a look at that. But that's a good question, actually. I'm not exactly sure, but I think it'd be very powerful to understand, does that stick or not? But it was conducted by the Harvard Business Review, to be very clear. And actually, it's been a powerful piece of research that has held for the past several years.
And thank you, Angie. It was a pleasure to have you virtually with us, if not in person. I wish you well. I hope you feel better. And for everyone in the room, thank you again to Angie, but we'll have a 5-minute leg stretch, move around a little bit, but don't go for a walk around the block, little break. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.